All right, get ready to dive deep into social media strategies for startups in 2024. We got a really interesting mix of sources for this one. Expert guides, trend predictions, even some psychology stuff about what makes people click. So get ready to rethink how you approach social media.
Yeah, it's not just about posting anymore, is it?
Not at all. It's about building a community.
And understanding each platform's little quirks.
Exactly. And to help us break it all down, we have our expert here.
Hi, everyone.
I am really curious to hear your take on all this, especially the so what insights,
Yeah.
Like, what are the big takeaways that startups can actually use?
Well, it's pretty fascinating because even though social media is always changing, the core stuff is still key. All of our sources agree that understanding your audience, making the right content, and building those real connections, that's more important than ever.
I noticed that emphasis on knowing your audience too, like it's social media 101,
Right.
but it seemed like every single source we looked at kept saying it over and over again.
Yeah, and it might seem basic, but for startups, it's everything. You just have limited resources. You can't be wasting time on the wrong platforms.
Right.
It's like depth over breadth. You've got to choose the platforms where your ideal customers actually are, not try to be everywhere, right?
Right, right. Like you wouldn't try to sell, I don't know, luxury watches on TikTok.
Exactly.
You'd go to where those watch enthusiasts are, like maybe Instagram or some really niche forums.
Totally. And speaking of platforms, that brings us to LinkedIn. I think we all know it's the place for B2B.
Right, over 830 million members.
Yeah. But think about it. It's not just the numbers. It's about the power of those specific groups and being able to target your ads to reach like decision makers.
Oh, in your exact niche?
Exactly. And that's gold for B2B startups.
Okay, yeah, I see what you mean about depth over breadth because you could spend all day trying to keep up with every platform, but it wouldn't necessarily get you those results.
Exactly. Now, if you're trying to reach a younger demographic, that visually driven crowd, Instagram and TikTok, that's where it's at. But even on those platforms, there are differences.
Mm.
A beautiful product video, that might work amazingly on Instagram,
Right.
but it could totally flop on TikTok.
Yeah.
It's all about, keeping it real and entertaining people.
Yeah, and speaking of TikTok, I have to admit, some of those trends, I feel like I'm in a different universe.
Uh,
It's all short form, high energy content,
right.
and that's not always easy to do, especially for a startup with a more complicated product or service.
Oh, for sure. And that actually highlights another takeaway from the research.
Yeah.
Content is king, but engagement is queen.
Oh, I love that. So it's not just about putting content out there.
No, but
It needs to grab attention and get people interacting.
absolutely. And our sources actually say there's over 100 different types of content you can create. You got your educational webinars and those long white papers, but then you've got the polls, quizzes, even visually driven infographics.
Wow, over 100. That's a lot to choose from. How do you even begin?
Right. It can feel overwhelming,
All right.
but the key is to think strategically. So instead of just posting randomly, you need a content strategy that lines up with what your audience likes.
And that platform's vibe, right?
Exactly. You wouldn't post a super serious white paper on TikTok,
No.
right? You'd want something much snappier, like a quick explainer video or something.
Or something using those trends, I guess.
Yeah.
That makes total sense. It's playing to the strength of each platform and knowing what your people actually want to see. But even with a great content strategy, there's still the challenge of getting people to actually interact with your content.
That's right. And that's where thinking about those content pipes comes in. Our sources highlight things like gamified content, things like polls, quizzes, those which Disney character are you? Quizzes.
Oh, I love those.
Right. We all love those secretly. They tap into that competitive part of us and get us clicking and sharing.
Oh, yeah. You're speaking my language now. I love those quizzes. And they're so effective because they're fun, but they make you think, oh, I wonder what my result will be. Like, I have to share this.
Exactly. It's finding those ways to be creative and make people curious and get them to want to interact with your brand.
Yeah.
And that kind of brings us to another big point. Paid advertising.
Ah, yes, paid advertising. I think a lot of startups, especially the newer ones, they get intimidated by this. It can feel like you're just throwing money into a black hole and hoping for the best.
Right. It's a common worry, especially when budgets are tight. But this is where it gets interesting. The sources we've got actually lay out some really smart ways to make those ad dollars work harder.
Okay, tell me more. How can startups make sure their ads are actually effective without, going broke?
The first thing is making sure things are aligned. Just like your regular content, your ads need to match the platform. A funny meme-style TikTok ad wouldn't really fit on LinkedIn.
Right. It's got to fit the audience you're going for.
Exactly. So it's not about just spending. It's about being strategic with who you're targeting.
Okay, that makes sense.
And another important point is the idea of using paid and organic content together. It's about amplifying what's already working. So if a certain post is doing great organically, that's a great one to boost.
Oh, I like that. So you're kind of building on the momentum.
Exactly. Taking what's already resonating and giving it a little extra oomph. And this is where social media ads are really powerful, that targeting and customization. You can get really specific about who sees those ads. Not just demographics, but interests, behaviors, even people who've already interacted with you.
Wow, so you're not just throwing it out there randomly, you're putting it right in front of the people who are most likely to be interested. That's powerful.
It is, and it all ties back to knowing your audience. The more you understand about that ideal customer, the better you can target those ads and create content that really speaks to them.
Okay, so we've talked about knowing our audience, making killer content, using ads smartly, but there's this other thing that keeps popping up in the sources. Community building. It feels like it's more than just a buzzword, you know?
You're absolutely right. It's essential, and the reason is simple. It builds trust. It turns customers into fans. It gets you valuable feedback. It's about creating a place where people feel connected to your brand in a real way.
I can see why that's so important today, because everything can feel so impersonal.
Right.
People want to feel like they belong, especially with the brands they support.
Totally. And the research backs that up. One stat that really stood out to me is that 51% of consumers remember brands better when they respond to them on social media. People want to feel heard.
Right.
And they appreciate it when brands actually take the time to engage with them.
So it's not just about posting and hoping for the best.
Nope.
You need to be present, having conversations. You actually have to care.
Absolutely. Think about those online forums, the Q&A sessions, even dedicated social media groups. These are all ways to create that feeling of community, a space where people want to hang out with each other and engage with your brand.
I love that. It's not just pushing your product.
Right.
It's about creating a space where people feel valued.
Exactly. And it all comes down to being authentic and transparent. No more faceless corporations. People want realness.
Yeah.
They want to see personality. They want to give feedback. They want to be a part of the journey.
That's such a good way to put it. Okay, so we've got audience targeting, making great content, using ads well, and the power of community. But there's one more piece of the puzzle, right? We have to know if all this stuff is working.
Absolutely. You've got to measure your success.
Right.
All this work is useless if you don't know what's working.
So let's talk data. What should startups be tracking?
Engagement's key. Are people liking, sharing, commenting? A high engagement rate, that's a good sign you're resonating with your audience.
They're like, hey, we see you. We like what you're doing.
Exactly. And then you've got follower growth. That tells you how fast your audience is growing. But remember, it's not just about the numbers, it's about attracting the right people.
The ones who are actually interested in what you offer.
Exactly, the ones who are going to become customers. So it's not about chasing those vanity metrics, it's about finding your tribe. And once you've found them, it's about analyzing and adjusting your strategy, right? Because social media is always changing.
Constantly. What worked last year might not work this year.
Exactly. You need to be flexible. You need to experiment. Be ready to look at the data and say, okay, this is working. This isn't. Let's switch things up.
Yeah.
And that leads us to something important that all our sources brought up, the challenges and risks. Social media isn't always easy, especially for startups.
Right. It's not all sunshine and rainbows.
Yeah.
It can be a bit of a minefield.
Right. Especially when you're starting out.
Yeah.
What are some of those big challenges that people should be ready for? Resource allocation is huge. A lot of startups have just one person doing everything.
Oh, I know that feeling. You're juggling a million things.
Right. Content, strategy, community, the whole shebang.
Yeah.
And then you've got crisis management. What happens if you get some bad press?
Oh, every social media manager's worst nightmare.
Right. That can be a real mess for startups.
Yeah.
Especially when they don't have the big company resources to handle it.
Yeah. Do our sources give any tips for handling that?
They do, and they really emphasize having a plan in place, knowing how to respond quickly and calmly. That can make a huge difference. It's not about preventing every crisis, but about knowing what to do when they happen.
Yeah, because being unprepared for something like that could really damage you, especially when you're new and trying to build trust.
Totally. And another challenge is just the crazy speed at which social media changes. It feels like every day there's a new platform, a new feature, a new algorithm.
It's true. Just keeping up with the trends feels like a full-time job.
Yeah, it can be overwhelming for sure. But the key is to stay informed, be ready to adapt, and focus on the platforms that matter most to your audience. Don't try to be on every single one.
That's good advice.
Right. Choose your battles.
Focus on where you can really make an impact.
Exactly. And speaking of impact, let's switch gears to something a bit more inspiring. Case studies.
Oh, yes. I love a good success story. Our sources included real examples of how startups are using social media to do incredible things. It's not just theory. We've got proof this stuff works.
Exactly. And what's interesting is our sources actually point out the value of case studies, particularly for startups.
Why is that? Why are they so impactful for new businesses?
They build credibility. Potential clients see how other companies, similar to theirs, have been successful.
It's just like, hey, don't just take our word for it.
Exactly. Look what these guys did. And what's also interesting is our sources highlight how these case studies can be used differently for B2B versus B2C.
Oh, that makes sense. The way you tell that success story might be different depending on who you're talking to.
Exactly. And speaking of different approaches and different audiences, we have to talk about the future of social media.
Yes, the future. Things are constantly evolving. What trends should startups be paying attention to as they navigate all these changes?
Well, one thing's for sure, new platforms will keep popping up. TikTok's just the beginning. There's always something new coming.
It's like always be ready to adapt, embrace the new, and never stop learning.
Right. And speaking of learning, AI's role is only going to get bigger in social media. We're already seeing it with content tools and social listening platforms. But as AI gets smarter, it's going to change how we use social media even more.
AI is definitely a game changer, but it also brings up a lot of questions. It's important to use it responsibly and ethically.
100%. We need to be careful about potential problems like bias in the data or privacy issues or even the risk of spreading misinformation.
Yeah.
It's a powerful tool.
Yeah.
We need to be smart about it.
So we've got new platforms, AI changing things, and always thinking about those ethical implications. Anything else we should be ready for?
The one thing that's not changing is the importance of being real. That authenticity in building community.
Back to the fundamentals. No matter how many platforms or fancy algorithms we get, it always comes back to making real connections.
Exactly. In a world where everyone's trying to get attention, being genuine is what makes you different.
Yeah.
It's what builds trust.
So how can startups really stand out and show their true selves online? Because it's easy to get lost in all the noise.
It starts with knowing your values, your mission. What do you stand for? Why do you do what you do? Let that come through in everything you post, your writing, your visuals, everything.
It's about more than just selling.
Right.
It's about sharing your story and connecting with people on a human level.
Exactly. And it's about transparency, showing what's going on behind the scenes, the good and the bad. People know when something's fake.
Yeah.
They want to see the real you, the human behind the brand.
And that honesty can be so powerful online. It makes you relatable and builds trust.
Absolutely. Be honest, be yourself, even be a little vulnerable. People connect with that. Okay, so are you ready to pull this all together and figure out how to use all this info?
Absolutely, because we've laid the groundwork, explored the trends, and even looked into the future. Now it's time to get practical. So stick with us as we shift gears and get into some actionable takeaways in the final part of this deep dive. We'll be right back.
Welcome back. All right. Let's get into those real-world examples. Remember, these aren't just, feel-good stories. These show how using social media strategically can make a big difference for startups.
Okay, I'm ready for some inspiration. Hit me with a case study that just blew your mind.
Okay, one that really stands out is this B2B SaaS startup. They totally transformed how they got leads using LinkedIn. They went from practically invisible to becoming thought leaders in their industry, like overnight.
All right, you've got my attention. How did they do that?
They really nailed that whole provide value thing we were talking about, They started by figuring out the biggest problems their target audience had, and then made content that offered solutions.
Real solutions.
Real solutions. Think insightful articles, how-to videos. They even did live Q&A sessions with experts.
So they basically became the go-to source for their niche.
Smart, exactly. And they didn't just make content, they were active in those LinkedIn groups.
Right.
They joined conversations, built relationships with influencers, the whole 9 yards.
It sounds like a perfect example of that two-pronged approach we talked about, right? Great content and community building.
Absolutely. And the results were pretty amazing. They saw their website traffic explode, a ton of new leads, and in the end, way more sales. It shows what a good social media strategy can do, especially for B2B.
Okay. That's seriously inspiring. But what about B2C? Any good stories for, say, our e-commerce listeners?
Of course. There's this sustainable fashion brand that comes to mind. They built this incredibly loyal following on Instagram.
Oh, okay. Tell me more. How did they crack the Instagram code?
Well, first off, their visuals were stunning, but they also did a fantastic job of showing off what their brand really stood for.
Oh, like their values.
Yes, ethical sourcing, environmental stuff, being transparent about their supply chain, they made it all part of their content.
So it was more than just pretty pictures. They connected with those people who really care about where their products come from and like the impact of their purchases.
Exactly. They also use those Instagram stories to give people a peek behind the curtain, showing their production process, their team, really humanizing the brand.
Yeah, that's a great way to make those personal connections. It makes people feel like they're part of something bigger, not just buying something.
Right. And to really get their message out there, they partnered with micro-influencers who had similar values.
And a similar look and feel, probably.
Yes, a perfect match.
It's amazing what you can achieve when you find the right partners and really nail that authenticity thing.
Yeah.
So what happened? What were the results?
Incredible. Their brand awareness and engagement skyrocketed, leading to, like, a massive boost in sales. They actually had to scale up production to keep up with demand.
Wow. Talk about a social media win. It shows that having a strong strategy and putting it into action can make a huge difference. But it's not always that easy, right? There must be some cautionary tales, too. Examples of what not to do.
Oh, definitely. You learn just as much from mistakes.
Right.
One common trap we see is startups trying to be on every platform without a clear plan.
Right. Back to that depth over breadth thing.
Exactly. It's much smarter to focus on a few platforms where your audience actually is.
Yay.
And really nail your approach there. Trying to do everything spreads you too thin, and then you end up doing a so-so job everywhere.
It's like quality over quantity, always.
Absolutely. And another mistake is forgetting about that community aspect. They focus so much on broadcasting their message that they forget to listen and engage with their audience.
So it's not just about shouting into the void. You need to create a two-way conversation.
Exactly. Social media is a chance to build those real relationships. If you're not doing that, you're missing out. And honestly, you might even come across as impersonal.
That makes total sense. So we've got those inspiring successes and some lessons from the not-so-successful ones. But now I'm wondering about the future of social media. What should startups be looking out for in this, like, constantly changing world?
That's a great question. And something that really stood out in the research is that the lines are blurring between social media and search.
Wait, what do you mean?
Think about it.
Yeah.
When you need to find information, where do you go first?
Google, I guess.
Maybe. But more and more, people are using platforms like TikTok and Instagram to search for everything. Product reviews, businesses near them, you name it.
Social media as the new Google, huh? That's a pretty big shift.
It is. And it means startups have to think differently about their social media presence.
Okay.
It's not just posting pretty pictures anymore. You have to make content that people can actually find when they're searching.
So how do you do that? Is it all about hashtags and keywords?
Hashtags are still important, but it's more than that. You've got to make good content that answers people's questions, that provides value, that uses relevant keywords naturally.
So it's like SEO, but for social media.
Exactly, social SEO. And it's not just about individual posts. It's about your whole profile, your bio, your description, everything.
So it's like treating your social media like its own mini website.
Yeah, optimize for search. And that's going to be even more important as these platforms change their search algorithms.
So social SEO is a big trend to watch. What else is coming?
Another one is the rise of what some sources call micro-communities.
Micro-community. What are those?
Think of them as smaller, more niche online groups based on specific interests or passions. They're like little ecosystems within the larger platforms.
Okay.
It could be a Facebook group, a subreddit, even a Slack channel.
So instead of trying to reach everybody, startups should focus on these smaller, more engaged groups.
Exactly. It's about finding your tribe, the people who are truly passionate about what you do.
Yeah.
And these communities are a goldmine for feedback.
Yeah, because people in those groups are already super engaged and want to share their opinions.
Right.
It's a great way to test new ideas, and build loyalty.
For sure. So we've got social SEO, micro-communities, two big trends. Anything else startups need to be ready for?
That's a lot to keep track of. Is anything staying the same?
The one thing that always matters, no matter how much tech changes, is authenticity.
Back to the fundamentals again.
It is. No matter what, people still want real connections.
So how can startups show their true selves online? It's easy to get lost in all the noise.
Start by knowing what you stand for, your values, your mission.
Yeah.
Let those shine through in everything you post, your captions, your visuals, everything.
It's about more than just selling. It's about your story.
Right, and be transparent. Show what's happening behind the scenes. People know when you're faking it.
Yeah.
They want the real you,
Yeah.
the human behind the brand.
And that realness, it can be really powerful online.
Right.
Makes you relatable.
Be honest, be yourself.
Builds trust.
People respond to that.
Nice.
Okay, ready to put this all together and figure out what you can actually do.
Absolutely. We've covered so much. Audience, content, the future. Now it's time to make it practical. Stick with us as we move into actionable steps in the final part of our deep dive. Be right back. Okay, we're back, and it's time to take all this amazing info and turn it into action. We've talked about the trends, we've seen the success stories, and maybe even cringed at some of those less successful moments. But the question is, what can you actually do with all this knowledge?
That's the key, isn't it? Knowing is only half the battle. You got to actually put it to work.
So let's boil it all down. What's the very first thing our listeners should do to step up their social media game?
I'd say go back to basics and really get to know your audience.
Back to basics. It always comes back to knowing who you're talking to.
It really does.
Yeah.
And it's more than just their age or where they live. You need to know their pain points. What keeps them up at night? What kind of content they're hungry for? You mentioned B2B earlier, so think about your ideal client. What are their biggest challenges? What would they find truly valuable?
Okay, so put on that detective hat and get inside their heads. Then what? What's the next step?
Time for a social media audit. Take a good look at your current presence. Are you on the right platforms? Is your content actually speaking to your audience? Are you building that community?
Right.
Or are you just kind of, shouting into the void?
It's like a social media checkup.
Yeah.
So many startups get so caught up in the daily grind that they forget to step back and look at the big picture.
It's easy to do. And remember, this isn't about judging yourself. It's about making sure everything you're doing is actually moving you towards your goals.
Right.
And don't be afraid to experiment. Try different content. Post at different times. Engage with your audience in new ways. See what works. See what needs tweaking.
Embrace that growth mindset, right? Always testing, iterating, refining. But with all this talk of strategy and optimizing and stuff, it's easy to forget about the human side of things.
Totally agree. At the end of the day, social media is about connecting with people.
Yeah, so don't get so caught up in the numbers and the algorithms that you forget to be human. Be authentic, have fun. Remember how you said those TikTok trends made you feel like you were in a different world?
I do.
Embrace that. Let your personality shine through.
I love that.
Show people the real you.
It's such a good point. Social media can be this powerful tool, but it's also a space for creativity and connection. So be yourself, share your story, build those relationships. That's what's going to make you stand out.
Beautifully said. And I think that's a perfect note to end on. We've covered so much ground today, from finding your audience to making engaging content to navigating the ever-changing world of social media. But remember, it all starts with that deep understanding of who you're talking to and being willing to adapt and learn along the way.
You got this. You have the knowledge, the insights. Now go out there and make it happen.
Go create amazing content, build those communities, and make your mark on the digital world. We'll be here cheering you on. Until next time, deep divers, keep exploring, keep learning, and keep diving deep.